Welcome to Research Debrief, the podcast that bridges the gap between the fitness industry and the latest science. Luke, what science are we diving into today?
We have a new paper just published. I think it's the largest, maybe most significant paper that looks at wearables. And specifically, this paper looks at the Apple Watch. Now, we're not picking on the Apple Watch. We're not even highlighting the effectiveness of the Apple Watch. There's a lot of different papers published on wearables as a whole. This paper is a meta-analysis that looks at all of the research that examines the efficacy of Apple Watch over the generations of that product. So the paper is published in the journal Digital Medicine. The title of the paper is The Accuracy of Apple Watch Measurements, a Living Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. And we always say this, a meta-analysis is just a collection of all the studies on a particular topic. So this paper represents our current understanding of the science around how accurate is my Apple Watch and all the data that I'm getting from my Apple Watch. Rachel, I think this topic is important because in our industry, when we talk about technology, one of my observations is technology in our industry is largely tracking what we're doing. Now, I like to say that the technological advances in our industry should be about what we're doing, how we're actually exercising. Oftentimes, the technology or the technological advancements we make are more about tracking what we are doing. And I think there's a place for that, but that's what most people are talking about, right? There's just so much discussion around wearables, and much of the feedback that the wearable is giving us is valuable. This paper is an important paper for exercise professionals and club operators to understand because every one of our members coming into our facilities is influenced by their wearable. And I'll make this statement that I think sometimes our consumer listens to their wearable more than they listen to anybody in the club. And the reason we have to understand this scientific data is to be able to speak to what your wearable is saying. So with your permission, we'll jump into it.
Yeah, makes sense. And yeah, sounds good.
So here's a couple of their key takeaways. The first is that not every metric that the Apple Watch gives you is going to be equal in its accuracy. So one of the areas that Apple Watch is really, really good is heart rate. So Apple Watch measured heart rate with good overall accuracy across a wide range of studies. So on average, we see measurements that even differ from device to device relative to a reference, actually measuring what your heart rate is by literally as little as 1 beat per minute. So this is really, really accurate. So I think our first takeaway here is you can generally trust your Apple Watch to monitor your heart rate during exercise and to observe changes over time. And that matters, right? When we gauge an exercise, we want to understand how much is my heart rate elevating? Am I in the appropriate zone? Am I exercising at an intensity level high enough to deliver the fitness outcome that I'm looking for? So that's really good news. Now, I think the second big takeaway is that some of the health metrics are not as accurate. So a couple that they say are accurate, we just talked about heart rate, that's accurate. Screening for like atrial fibrillation, so AFib, is actually very accurate. And this is pretty important. When you go into AFib, you would want to be aware of that. Your Apple Watch detecting that has been largely accurate. And we kind of hear these anecdotes and stories where people say, well, my watch told me that I was in AFib, and eventually I scheduled with a doctor, and it was a good thing that I did. So this paper says, yep, that's largely accurate. We're detecting AFib accurately with the Apple Watch. Now, less accurate. So those are two that they said are really accurate, heart rate and then being able to detect AFib. Moderately accurate was sleep duration and step count. Now, I think these are both really important because the fitness consumer is absolutely tracking sleep and paying attention to sleep. How much sleep am I getting? What's the quality of my sleep? Am I getting a decent amount of deep sleep? And then, of course, step count. And I think step count might be one of the physical activity variables that people wearing wearables are the most interested in. And this study says, well, it was moderately accurate, less accurate than heart rate or being able to screen for AFib. The least accurate, and this might be the most important takeaway on this part of the paper, was calories expended in my exercise and over the course of my day. That's number one. And number two, estimated VO2 max. And those are both really important. Calories, everyone is seemingly interested in burning more calories. You should not trust your Apple Watch to tell you how many calories you're burning. And then your estimated VO2 max. VO2 max is been around for a long time, the better part of 4 decades, but we're talking about it all the time right now because we know VO2 max is very closely correlated with all-cause mortality. So the higher your VO2 max, the less likely you are to die of all causes. So we're paying attention to VO2 max. Your Apple Watch is not good at tracking VO2 max. Now, let's talk about calories. Many of the studies look at air that was 20% off on calorie expenditure. A number of the studies show that during exercise, the calorie expenditure was off by up to 100%. Wild variability from person to person. So the practical takeaway here is don't use your Apple Watch to determine exactly how many calories that you've burned. Next, I think that one of our key takeaways is that Apple Watch is useful for general health monitoring, but we should not use it as a medical device. So we already mentioned AFib, really good at identifying AFib. But across all these papers, the authors summarize saying, use the wearable as an adjunct to medical care. My goodness, don't use it as a replacement for clinical testing. And that's an important message. I don't think anyone's actually doing that. I think most people are saying, yes, I will use the wearable, I will wear the Apple Watch, and I'm still going to see my primary care physician and undergo kind of normal diagnostic testing. And then one of our other big takeaways is that the trends over time are often more valuable than any single measurement. So the question I always have on a wearable, even if it's not precise, is it directionally accurate? So maybe it's wrong, but if I improve whatever the variable is, will I see that improvement? Can I track that improvement over time? Maybe another way to look at this, is the accuracy good enough for what we're looking for? And here's what the authors conclude. If it's personal health tracking, if it's monitoring your exercise, your heart rate, for example, understanding your exercise trends over the long haul, it's good enough for that. Okay? It is not good enough for things like clinical diagnostic. It's not good enough for really precise physiological measurement on things like calories. It is not precise on things like VO2 max. Okay? So the Apple Watch, effective, but more effective for some things, less effective for other things. I'll jump right to their big conclusion, or this is my interpretation of their conclusion. Apple Watch is an excellent tool for tracking heart rate, identifying broad health trends, supporting personal health monitoring. However, not every metric is equally accurate. So heart rate is really, really good. Calorie expenditure, VO2 max are not good. I think in the health clubs, in fitness studios, we need to be aware of this so we can speak to this with our customers. There's not a week that goes by that I don't talk to someone that says, but my Apple Watch says this, but my wearable says this. Accurate in terms of heart rate, less accurate on calorie expenditure and VO2 max data.
Yeah, makes sense. As technologies of all kinds become more prevalent, right now it's wearables, who knows what's in the future, is it important for fitness professionals to be as educated as possible on the scientific evidence supporting these type of things so that they can talk to their members appropriately?
Yeah, I think it's so incredibly important because when we started, I said, I think sometimes our members are trusting their Apple Watch more than they're trusting, whatever we're telling them in the club. And so we need to be able to speak with specificity to, hey, here's what you should trust from your Apple Watch, and here's what you probably shouldn't trust. And we're doing wonderful medical scientific research on this. We have to continue to bring that into the club because ultimately, I think we want our member to trust our brand. We want them to trust our club and the people in the club even more than their wearables. We have to be able to speak to that.
Yeah, makes sense.